Hi, my name is Kirsten Gray. I am going to be doing an online presentation today, not just about human trafficking, but specifically labor trafficking, the human trafficking of individuals for the purpose of labor exploitation. And I think it's really important to raise this awareness and really tackle this issue head on, mostly using an integrated approach. And so that's going to be the purpose of my paper, is to inform you and raise awareness, and then eventually tell you how that integrated approach is going to do those things. So let's get started. I'm excited to tell you about it. Human trafficking in general employs millions of people and it makes billions of dollars a year. And it's an industry that operates worldwide. It's transnational, part of transnational organized crime. This issue has been referred to as a form of modern day slavery. And that's just because, people are being trafficked, bought, and sold like slaves were. They're living in poor conditions, they're being abused mentally, physically, emotionally, so it makes sense. The International Labor Organization actually estimated that over a 10-year period, 20.9 million people, which is roughly 3 out of every 1,000 people worldwide, have been victims of forced labor or sexual exploitation. That encompasses both things. And while human trafficking is a big issue, and I'm not trying to discount any other types of trafficking, I would like to focus on forced labor trafficking, just because when I was doing my research, I was not originally aware of how big of an issue it was, and I thought it was really interesting that it's such a predominant issue and we don't really hear much about it. So, it was actually found that the International Labor Office discovered that the amount of non-sex labor trafficking victims, which would be, forced labor victims, outnumbered sex trafficking victims by over 3 times. That's a lot. That's a really big difference. These victims, they could be coerced or threatened into leaving with their offenders, and they're going to live a less than satisfactory life with little hope to escape once they get to their new destination. So, to combat human trafficking for labor exploitation, like I said before, an integrated approach must be devised. It has to be understood, has to be placed in the community. And when I say community, I don't just mean, I mean everybody. It's the lawmakers, the government, the everyday citizens. Everyone has to understand and be aware and have the knowledge to combat this problem. So before I explain the integrated approach in more detail, I would like to further give you a better understanding of what labor trafficking is and why it's an important issue. First, I think it's important to understand that forced labor and human trafficking are 2 different things. They are 2 different definitions, and the central issue in identifying labor trafficking itself is that we need to clear up the confusion on its definition. Human trafficking and forced labor can happen independently of each other, but they're still closely related and overlap in certain situations. For example, the means by which a person is placed in a situation of trafficking, like threats, coercion, force, deception, abuse of a position of vulnerability, and the means by which forced labor is carried out, like threats, coercion, using the person's dependency, are obviously 2 very similar things. One definition refers to human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or other forms of coercion, abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or the abuse of a position of vulnerability for the purpose of exploitation. Now that is a mouthful, so to put it in simpler terms, it's referring to the harboring, obtaining, recruiting victims for the purpose of labor or sex by using fraud, coercion, or force. Simple, short. So the definition of forced labor itself actually came from the Forced Labor Convention, which was hosted by the International Labor Organization in 1930. So it's important to understand that this definition is over 100 years old and was created in a different historical setting, a different social context. But going back, they defined it as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which that said person has not offered himself voluntarily. So the penalty, it could mean, it's not necessarily penal sanctions. It could be the loss of rights and privileges, and the menace of the penalty can be carried out in many different forms. It could be physical abuse, threats, and not just threats to the victim, but also to their family. The trafficking protocol is what finally incorporated the forced labor into the human trafficking definition, because before, forced labor wasn't really a part of it, and that's why there was an issue for such a long time connecting the two. But when they included the forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs, it was a major step forward for criminal justice cases. So, because there's not a lot of awareness, I'm sorry, I'm sick, so I'm scatterbrained. Going back, the definition, it was a big step, and because it was so old, we need to raise awareness so that we can readdress it. When it comes up in criminal cases, lawmakers or decision makers have a lot of questions about it. For example, one of the problems with the definition of forced labor is that it says that the victim must offer himself voluntarily. But in many cases, the victim may be offering himself voluntarily because he's promised a better life in a different country, or she has paid the money to go to a different country and has been promised a job and a better life. So it doesn't take much convincing to get them to go. But that's just one example. And then, even though forced labor is now included in the definition of human trafficking, the definition of it results in some cases slipping through the cracks of the legal system. It's also important to understand the complexity of this crime and what kind of harm it does to our society. It's, like I said before, a transnational organized crime, and as I referred before, it's because it's so, it's easier for offenders to traffic between countries, and that may make a little more sense here in a minute. It takes less convincing. Someone in an underdeveloped country is more likely to be convinced or tricked that this offender is going to help them gain a job, a better life in a wealthier country. They may not know that they're being trafficked, and so they're going to go of their own free will. They're going to get to this new country. They're going to be in debt to this person, discover poor living conditions, possibly be abused, and there's going to be no support system for them to turn to for help. And on top of that, this victim isn't likely to go to law enforcement officers because they are most likely here illegally, or maybe they're afraid of their offender. It's just, there's no help for them. So now they're trapped as part of the trafficking organization, and even in situations where victims do not go of their own free will, it is still common for them to be transported to another nation because, like I said before, they don't have that support system. There's less of a chance of someone to come looking in that country specifically for them, so it is easier for these offenders to get away with it in the long run if there's no ties, if the victim does not have ties to the community that they're being put in. So, on top of labor trafficking being a violation of human rights, it's also an economic crime. When victims were in a private economy, it was found that 68% of them were coerced to work in activities such as agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and domestic labor. This is a very wide variety of jobs, and human trafficking with the purpose of labor exploitation excludes the victims from the labor market. And so it's undermining the legitimate economic development for businesses, governments, and developing countries. It's not letting them compete ethically for the labor or goods or services. And all those profits made from this victim of labor trafficking and their offenders, it's going into the pocket of gray markets and criminal enterprises. And that's billions of dollars that different countries' economies are not seeing each year. So it's really important, not just for the violation of human rights aspect, but also because these economies could be flourishing and could be doing a lot better than they are if we had these workers to work. But now getting to my point, now that you have a better understanding, in fighting the crime of forced labor trafficking, awareness in the community is essential. This can be achieved while also formulating a plan involving an integrated approach. They can be done at the same time. This approach would ensure that we are using multiple fields of law and multiple nations in order to best avoid meeting strict limitations. It would require the participants of it to possess the knowledge and skills and awareness needed in order to effectively investigate and prosecute cases, as well as to properly identify and assist the victims of each case. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of things that go into it. And as I said before, these cases have so many moving parts. You have to have the knowledge, you have to have the awareness, because otherwise you're not going to be able to pick out the telltale signs that maybe something criminal is going on here. A key piece of information in the integrated approach is understanding what a stakeholder is. The Dutch Ministry of Social Affairs developed a barrier model to help identify participants and stakeholders in these cases. And the barrier model basically identifies 5 barriers that a offender and victim face when coming into a country. This is entrance into the country, housing, identity, labor, and financial flows. And the facilitators in each of these actions have the ability to potentially stop them from overcoming the barriers. So, my paper lays out some specific examples of each type of barrier, and it talks about the different stakeholders. Basically, getting back to what a stakeholder is, it's just the facilitator that may be knowingly or unknowingly helping this offender get away with their crime. And if these stakeholders can identify that something wrong is going on, then they are better able to build those barriers up so that the offender does not get away with his crime. Or at least they would be able to identify it and get in contact with people that could do something about it. They're found at early and late stages of the trafficking process, and each has the knowledge to contribute to help reduce the amount of successful trafficking cases. They have to effectively share information, knowledge, and communicate effectively. And even civil society and individuals within that society can potentially be stakeholders and providers of information. These people see the victims every day. They may work in the same company or be neighbors. They come into contact with them, and they could provide valuable information on the victim and their associates. So as I said before, it's not just important to raise awareness in the formal organizations and formal stakeholders, but it's also important to raise awareness in the community just in general, so that when we do this integrated approach, everyone is able to effectively talk about the problem, and they're effectively able to use that knowledge that they've gained to know what to do. It's, like I said, it's a big issue. My paper goes into a little more detail about it, and as far as what you or I could do, like I said, raise awareness, read my paper, and there are hotlines out there if you suspect anyone is a victim. They're on the humantraffickinghotline.org website, and you can dial those extensions, give anonymous tips, anonymous calls, and I just hope that we can use this integrated approach in our society and combat this issue and eventually start making some differences and raise awareness so that people want to make a difference. But thanks for listening, and that's all for now.